this evening, and welcome to the International Lecture Series of the Bartlett. And I'm just saying a few words to introduce Lars Spuybroek, which we are really delighted to have with us tonight. I met Lars in Atlanta, I think, sort of 2 years ago, where he is a professor for the last few years, and even sat down with him on some quiz. And Lars was sort of impressive, not only as a critic, but as a teacher. And I knew, obviously, of Lars massively because everybody, at least my generation, and I think even the younger generation, had the NOX book on their tables. It was sort of a must book that everybody had a few years ago, and I still even see students nowadays sometimes coming up with a NOX book. So it was really interesting to realize that Lars had to go through a shift from somebody who was really involved in building designing installations, building them, even some buildings, to somebody who became much more heavily involved in theory and in writing. And already at the time I asked him why was that, and I just asked him right now. And Lars was just saying that he felt, in a funny way, first of all, very comfortable in writing and spending time in developing his own ideas, when he was not sort of bothered by a client telling him that he had to sort of build in a different way or having financial discussions. But in fact, Lars came from a background where his father was in fine arts. He studied even art history for a period in Florence. He studied architecture at TU Delft. But there was an interest that he had implicit in his work in history that he always had, and therefore he became increasingly more devoted to writing books of architecture. There are certain themes that are really important of what Lars has been writing about and what was already sort of partly implicit in his work when he was doing NOX, which is in a way an interest in computation in general, but the structural aspects of certain architects in history and how that had a reflection on the computational new modes of production in the beginning of the 2000s, but even more recently, but also issues of ornamentation, patternization in contemporary architecture, and where, in a way, the origins of all this came from. He wrote quite a few books that sort of are quite extraordinary, apart from the main book, NOX, at that time. He wrote Architecture of Variation, Textile, Tectonics, The Sympathy of Things, Ruskin, and the Ecology of Design. And I understood that he will talk about Ruskin tonight quite a bit. Vital Beauty, Reclaiming Aesthetics in the Tangle of Technology and Nature, and even quite a few other books that he sort of has been involved with. I just heard that he came from a discussion with Thames and Hudson, so I guess there's something else new in the pipeline. After being at the TU Delft, he was involved, as I said, with NOX. He was a professor for a period in Kassel in Germany. He taught at Columbia University, and even for 2 years he was a visiting professor at Bartlett for a short period, where he came in and out and gave workshops and so on here. I also mentioned, so he is, for quite a few years, Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and in fact even moved to Atlanta, where he's now living. So I think I noticed there's sort of an interesting mix of people in the audience, which is quite unusual in the sense that you get different generations and different interests that Lars is covering, because of this sort of widespread interest in topics that are not only on one liner sort of thought, but actually quite multi-layered in the interpretations of history and what new modes of computation are. Thank you for coming. It will be a great pleasure to get you. Apart from everything, Lars is somebody who has great humor. He has a sort of, it's an amazing person to hang out with. I remember already Peter Cook saying that, Neil Spiller, Stephen and others mentioned that, and when we were there having a lunch at that time in Atlanta, Lars was sort of really a jolly person to have around and to listen to. So, welcome Lars to the Bartlett.
I won't do a jolly lecture tonight. I can get the screen. So, I won't spend a lot of time why I stopped doing architecture. It just at a certain moment it gets boring. You guys don't know that yet, but writing is you can write whatever you want. You can do your own notes. You can do your own argument, and try to do that with a building. This is it's a bit of the projector, but that's on the right. That's I'm not sure if you actually if you know that blue book. That's from I think 2009, and it has some texts in it that are much earlier, and one of them is the structure of vagueness, and which was a very important term for me at that time. Vagueness as a sort of a notion of indeterminacy. And I have to tell you, I entered digital design via digital art. So I was trained as an architect. I got detoured, so to speak, after I graduated. I won a big prize with my architecture project, and then I said, okay, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to do something else, and I became part of what is in Holland is the V2, is the Institute of Unstable Media, which was electronic art, which is basically Ars Electronica in Austria and ZKM in Germany and V2 in Holland. And I got really interested in the mixture of media and architecture. And I published a text on liquid architecture, which was completely misunderstood by people from the Ministry of Water Management. And that's how I got to design the water pavilion, which is in December is 20 years ago. It's 20 years ago. And that's the first building that has a continuously developing geometry with media and sensors, which was very special. But for me, it was not, because if you look at the history of digital design, you see that there's sort of a American formalism, Peter Eisman, people like that, and Frank Gehry. And there's a whole generation that came out of that, but I came from a completely different angle. I came from Virilio. We were translating Virilio, we were translating Baudrillard, reading Kittler, Florian Ritzer, all this sort of a German-French media theory. And that's sort of the angle I entered architecture with, and I was publishing on liquid architecture, so, and I was drawn back in architecture by people who misunderstood what I wrote. And then when I built that, I slowly moved don't forget that in the 1990s, we were all thinking animation, right? That was the notion. And that comes out of this concept of the fold. You start with a volume, and what we call embryologically or epigenetically, in a more romantic term, you would unfold that object by varying it. Of course, that's what we now call gradual variation or smooth variation. And the object varies, and you can freeze frame each of these variations, like as Greg Lynn did. But Greg clearly comes from that direction of Peter Eisman, and with that notion of form and movement in my head, I was already thinking something different. And then I met Frei Otto in 1997. Frei Otto, the German engineer, the German Ted Happold, so to speak. And he showed that image on the right, which shows his crazy model. I'm not sure if you know the work of Frei Otto, but Frei Otto did something completely different than what we were doing. Frei Otto was doing analog computing. So he was not doing digital computing, he was doing analog computing. So he was working with soap film, he was working with paper, he was working with sand. And one of these machines he built with one of his PhD students was the wool thread model. And the wool thread model would be able to calculate, right? We're calculating with matter here, right? We're not calculating with digits, we're calculating with matter. And this is the final image of 3. So this is 3 images, but there's another 3 that goes in a stepwise, that's already important because computation always works stepwise. It went from a set of steps to this very complex end product, which is an optimized path system. And it was made out of wool threads. It was a machine out of wool threads that were connecting points, and they would all have a certain amount of slack, right? A certain overlength of 4, 5, 8%, whatever the machine needs. And they would dip it in water, take it out, and you would generate these structures. And these are the same structures that you see. Well, when I was teaching at Columbia, you could see them when there was snow on the campus and people were inventing their own path systems, like you would see with ants on the forest floor. They would generate their own path systems, and they would negotiate a certain collective length. And that's what you see here. There's all the overlength, all the redundancy of the system gets negotiated by sticking these threads together. And you would get this system. What I want to say is that movement and structure is in the reverse order. So it's not like we start with a primitive and then we put movement on it and we freeze frame it every 5 frames, and then we build it, hopefully, with a lot of help of engineers. No, this is the reverse. So we have elements that move, and when they move, they move collectively. That's the first thing that's important. They don't move out of artistic reasons. They move because they want to find each other, right? So when they move, they create structure. So this is the first idea that's a non-formalist notion of computing. You see the same with the catenary techniques of Gaudi, that the interaction of the catenary curves, right? If you ever studied this, how the catenary curves interact by these weights, and then they find form, as Friotto would say, right? So we're not giving form, we're finding form. And it starts with activity, it starts with movement, and then it finds structure. So the relationship between form and movement is exactly the other way around as, let's say, the American formalists. And the notion that came out of Peter Eisenman, that you have some kind of normative structure, you deconstruct it, you deform it, you bend it, there's a Baroque set of operations that you add folds to it as a critique of the normative system, and then hopefully it's buildable. In this case, it is already structurally, it has a structural principle. So this is a constructivism. And that's when I met Friotto, I suddenly saw this whole digital world reversed, and having a material vector, right? Having a material vector that actually fitted much better with Deleuze's other research, right? Not just Le Pli, but all the other, especially like 1,000 Plateaus, where we talk about the material vector and following the material. So I saw that reversal of structure and movement. Now, normally you would have a career, let's say in architecture, you would have a career going from the left to the right, right? You would start like with historical stuff, and you would maybe see Zemper, that's the one in the middle, and then you would discover Friotto, and you would make a historical link. I went the reverse way. So for me, it started in 1997, meeting Friotto on the right, and then I moved to Zemper, and then I moved to Ruskin. Right, this is like a whole set of operations. But you will notice when I talk about Ruskin, you'll see a lot of this terminology that I got from Friotto, this notion of the, especially material as something active, right, that is not inert, but has its own notion of activity and constantly finds form, that I then related to Ruskin, which was of course pretty shocking for me, right? That there's some historical, especially an historical precedent like Ruskin, who is a Luddite, right? Who is so anti-machinery, who is violently anti-machinery. Yeah? He would refuse to take the train. Right? He would go by coach. He would go to Dover to get the boat to France, and he would go by coach over there. He would refuse to take the train, but there was already trains to do the grand tour, right? He was so completely anti-machinery, but the anti-machinery of Ruskin, which is my argument, right, is very close to the machinery of Charles Babbage, which is, is of course the inventor of computation in England, right, the difference engine. Is really a notion, Charles Babbage himself described it. Don't forget Charles Babbage as an inventor of the difference engine. He is actually also a critic of design, right? Wrote a massive volume on the Crystal Palace exhibition, right? Describing all these objects, and he would say, look, with computation, with my difference engine, we could actually create perfect objects that are all the same. Right, and that's Ruskin's critique on computation or on machinery, is that they would actually produce constant sameness, constant repetition of sameness. Now, what's interesting, that critique on Victorian industrialism of Ruskin, he connects to classicism, right? So Ruskin's opposition of classicism and Gothicism is, you should see or understand in that Victorian debate, right, of people like Ruskin against the industrial liberalism of his time. So classicism is an architecture invented as it seems to make plagiarists of its architect. Why? Because you would have a book of Palladio in your lap or Sterlio, and you would copy the objects that they prescribed in these canonical handbooks. And you would copy them for your own design. So you're becoming a plagiarist. Slaves of its workmen, right? So as a workman, you basically get the drawing of the master architect, and you have to execute it exactly as it has been drawn, right? So you become a slave. So his aesthetic argument is immediately an ethical argument, which is really important in Ruskin. And Sybarites of inhabitants, hedonists of its inhabitants. Right, an architecture in which intellect is idle, invention impossible. Invention impossible. But that's a really important romantic argument. Now, this is one of the core sentences. There are many core sentences in the second volume of The Stones of Venice, The Nature of Gothic. Excuse me. And there's a whole set, which is already extraordinary. Now, Ruskin's let's say, theory of the Gothic is not taken seriously by people like Paul Frankel or Henri Fauquelin or Erwin Panofsky, right? I think in all the theorists on the Gothic, only Paul Franco spends like one paragraph on Ruskin. The rest is they just call him a dilettante and an obscure theorist of the Gothic. But what is so interesting is that in Ruskin's notion of the Gothic, he's not using stylistic characteristics. He's using characteristics that describes the systemacy of the Gothic. And these are the six. These are the six. Savageness, changefulness, they're very strange terms. They're actually beautiful English, changefulness. Naturalism, grotesqueness, rigidity, redundancy. Now for us, normally redundancy would be very important because in computing and the notion of variation and parametricism, redundancy is really important. But I'm going to skip that. I'm going to concentrate on savageness, changefulness, and rigidity. Now, savageness is for Ruskin one of the most important ones, let's say that the critics of Ruskin normally describe this argument as the most powerful of the six because it's an ethical argument, right? It's about the notion of labor. So basically, savageness means that the northern, right, because Gothic is northern, the northern workmen are so rough and blunt, right, and with their heads in the mist and their feet in the mud, they can only do rough stuff, right? So there's a notion of roughness in the work and how they execute the drawing. And if that drawing is open enough, if and that's of course what happens in the Gothic, it allows for a certain type of openness or interpretation by the workman, and that creates imperfection. Now that's a really important term, imperfection, because he believes that when architecture strives for imperfection, so to speak, that it actually, in that sense, it detours the dangers of classicism because that strives for perfection. Right, for pure execution. So that notion of savageness, now savageness in itself is a new term. You already see the word savage with people like Owen Jones, But the deeper notion is not savageness, but it's rough variation. They talk about roughness. Now, roughness you will already see some like 80 years earlier than Ruskin with people like William Gilpin and Ovidale Price. They would try to mix smooth variation or gradual variation. In terms of Hogarth and Burke, beauty would be something that is about smooth or gradual variation. Now that needs to be interspersed with something that is rough. I mean, people like Ovidale Price would actually say you need to, in landscape design or when you even organize trips, you need to mix smooth landscapes with rough landscapes. Right, so the notion of the picturesque, right, this is an aesthetic description of the picturesque, is always a mixture of smooth and rough variation. So Ruskin, when he talks about smoothness or talks about savageness, you have to understand that he places that older idea of the picturesque in a newer context that is not merely aesthetic but also ethical. Right, Ruskin always had a very strong idea about the picturesque being related to ethics. If you visit in the 1780s, you love the picturesque, and you're going to visit like picturesque homes and picturesque farms. You would, like Ruskin, you would notice at a certain point there's poor people living there. It's the picturesque is not for rich people. It's like classicism, right, which strives for perfection. That's for rich people, but the picturesque as a broken aggregate of architectural masses is something of poor people. So Ruskin, like doing his grand tours in the 1840s and early 1850s, he would say, look, we have a problem. If we love the picturesque so much, why are we looking at poor people all the time, at the homes of poor people? So for him, there's already an ethical argument in the notion of savageness. But it is connected to life. Now, this word life is not innocent. Now, thank God the 39 volumes of Ruskin's work are now all like digital, so you can just type in words like sympathy. Of course, that's what I would do. And I would get like a whole list of in what volumes it would actually occur. If you do that with the word life or vital or vitalized, you would get tons of hits. So my argument already on like page 15 or 16 of my book is, okay, we're not reading Ruskin as a Christian, because that would be the sort of prevalent critique, right, on Ruskin, that he's like, he gives a Christian theory of architectural design and of aesthetics. But the ones that don't agree with that would do the second. They would say, okay, Ruskin, we shouldn't look at him as a Christian, but maybe as a humanist. Right? And I'm not even doing that. I'm not looking at him as a Christian nor as a humanist, but as a vitalist. So I'm looking at Ruskin from a very specific point of view, as a vitalist. That means as somebody who considers matter as active, right? Just putting it in the perspective of Fray Otto, right? That's for these people, for vitalists. You could talk about life force and élan vital, whatever, about Bergson. But it's really about matter taking matter in its own hands, so to speak. Matter thinking for itself. So imperfection is in some sort essential to all what we know of life. So life, the products of life are not perfect, right? That's an anti-classicist argument of the Gothic. It's an anti-classicist argument. Nothing that lives is or can be rigidly perfect. Part of it is decaying, part of it is nascent. That means he's not looking at objects purely in space anymore, but he's looking at objects in time as well. They're nascent, then there's an object, so there's something growing toward form. There's something in the making, as Bergson would say. There's not just the made with its own aesthetics. There's something that is in the making. There's the object, and there's something that goes out of the making. It's decaying. So an object is like a vector in time, which is very, very typical for that notion of the picturesque. You're looking at an object as if it has been grown and is still growing or still decaying. So you're not looking at a stable object that is perfectly sort of coming towards us in space. No, it's part of time, and your experience then is also part of that time. You're sharing with that object the same temporality. Nothing that lives is or can be rigidly perfect. Now that lives means he's not looking at life as biology, right? He's not talking about plants, he's not talking about animals or people, yes that too, but also about clouds, mountains, objects of aesthetics, buildings, churches, whatever. So all things are alive in some degree. He actually says that all things are alive in some degree. Now that's hardcore vitalism. That's hardcore vitalism. A lot of vitalists you would like read, like Hans Driesch, they would apply some Aristotelian term like entelechy onto biological objects like animals, right? But not to crystals or mountains or clouds. And that's what Ruskin is actually doing. So that's pretty hardcore. Now changefulness, the second category, is for me is more important than savageness. So for me it's actually changefulness, which is smooth variation, which was very well theorized already by William Hogarth and Edmund Burke. Right, so there's a much longer, older history of changefulness, which is actually the word variety. Right, if you look at Hogarth's The Analysis of Beauty, there's on the frontispiece, right, there's this famous pyramid, there's a snake in there, which is the serpentine line, right, and what does it say underneath is like variety, right, so it's about variation. So somehow we have to figure out how these two are interconnected. Right? How does smooth variation and changefulness, how does it relate to rough variation and savageness? If we can solve that, we would solve a lot. Gothic design was capable of perpetual novelty. If you read a sentence like that, you're really at the heart of vitalism, because novelty, the term novelty is a deeply romantic term. Philosophers like Bergson, Deleuze, whatever, 200 years later, they would always talk about how is the new possible, right? Because if you don't believe in classicist typology, where things repeat all the time, because we have this Platonic machinery of transcendence, right, that sends always the same information to objects from above, right? Somehow you have to explain the new. Right? And that newness is always explained in the connection between these two notions of variety, smooth variation and raw variation. So perpetual novelty. The pointed arch was not merely a bold variation from the round, which is of course the classical one, but it admitted millions of variations in itself. This is like a biologist talking about species. Right? Millions of variations. So somehow an object is now contained in a population of variation. Right? Like sunflowers, people, zebras, whatever. So they have like names, they are certain species, but they only exist through a population of variations. And that goes for the pointed arch, the group shaft, the tracery window, all these. And the question then is, how is that possible? How is the Gothic capable of organizing perpetual novelty? How is it possible that novelty is not, let's say, typology that is then reinvented by subjects, right? Because that's how we normally understand novelty, right? There's the timelessness of typology. Let's say there's an opera house, and then every architect over and over again reinterprets that notion of the opera on different sites, right? It's different than, let's say, in the middle of London than in the harbor of Sydney, right? And that allows you to create novelty. And in this case, novelty is internal to the system. It's not external. It's not the subject just adding contingency to an order. No, it's internal to the system. So I was thinking, like, how is that possible? Because for me, this was like the core sentence in the Stones of Venice. Like, because it really shows a deep insight how this is organized. Right? So you look at the group shaft, and Ruskin is actually drawing these tables. Now, drawing tables of objects is what you see with Ernst Haeckel and Darwin, right? Where you see the finches with their beaks. You see like 30 different finches, and they all have different types of beaks. And that makes you understand how variation is organized. You always need to draw a table. You see the same with Ernst Haeckel with his radiolaria studies. So you look at Ruskin, suddenly you see a biological study of grouped shafts, or compound piers, officially termed. And you see something happening. There's an organization of objects there that enables it to become different all the time. So it's not like a preset object, like a fluted column, Doric, Ionic, or Corinthian. No, there's something that allows it to become different over and over. And it's the same with the traceried window, and it's the same with the netted vault. Right? So Ruskin is not like using the terms of Robert Willis saying, oh, this is mid-pointed, or this is flamboyant, and this is high Gothic, whatever. He uses that too, but that's not the point. The point is how these things emerge, how novelty of these objects is actually possible. And that's the rib, right? Now, and the rib in Gothic theory, or aesthetic theory on the Gothic, made lots of people very nervous. Especially structural engineers. There's been tons of texts saying, oh, okay, the Gothic is like a pre-high-tech, right? And we'll get to Villette later, but it's some kind of pre-high-tech, that rib is some kind of pre-modernist object, but what is so incredibly interesting, it's actually not determined at all, not as a column, not as a mullion, not as a piece of maybe like a tension rod or some kind of compression element. It's purely rib. It's a highly articulated element, but it's completely unclear what it is doing structurally, right? Somehow it's guiding the formalization of objects, but also somehow it's guiding the actual construction of the object, right? So like with the vault, but a real proper, you cannot really determine it structurally, you cannot really determine it in art history nor in aesthetic theory. So there's a vagueness to that object. There's a vagueness to that object. And we started looking at it, we said, look, if you look carefully, you see that in the grouped shaft, there's a bundling of ribs. So though the rib itself is underdefined, by bundling or by interacting with other elements, it can become defined on a larger scale, right? So you have a number of ribs, right, that can bundle, intertwine, or interlace, and then produce a product. Now that's interesting, because that means that the Gothic does not have elements like Greek or classical architecture, where you would say, okay, there we have pedestals, there we have domes, there we have friezes, all these elements that are predefined. There's something that precedes those elements. It's like a sub-element, right? But it's less defined, it's indeterminate, vague, right, in my earlier terminology. So there's a certain vagueness, and by teaming up with other elements, it can become determined as a group, right? So there's a collectivism and there's a constructivism to it, right? By bundling, it makes a shaft. By unraveling, it makes a fan, right? By interlacing, it makes a netted vault. And now these terms, if you've ever done scripting or you've ever done computing, and not as a modeling technique, but really as a scripting technique, you'll see that this is a very precise definition of parametricism. Now, this is not parametricism in the sense that Patrick talks about it. This is pretty different, right? So Patrick talks about parametricism in the sense of what Hogarth would do, right? There's an S-curve, and that S-curve can vary. Now, that's important, but that's purely smooth variation, but it only varies on its own, right? For aesthetic reasons. Now these Gothic figures, I call them figures, they also vary in their curvature. So there's a J shaft, and there's an S curve, and there's a C curve. There's all types of curvature that you find in Gothic ribs, but they only curve to find others, right? To create a shaft, to create a window, to create a vault, right? So it's a parametricism that actually produces objects, and that goes from a state of vagueness to a state of determinacy. And this is what we do with students. You can't really see it, but on the bottom left you see sort of parametric notations. You see C curves, J curves, and S curves. So the S curve of a Hogarth is actually in there, but it's only in there as a part of that sort of activity of these elements. So we get, like, on the one hand, we get very precise figures, very precise sets of figures, J curves, S curves, and C curves, and they all have their own amount of minimum, maximum curvature, right? And I don't mind if they're not cubic curves like splines. These are all circles and straights and whatever. I don't care. But these figures only vary to create configurations, right? So it's a set of figures where all the movement, all activities is there, and they create configurations. So it's a very constructivist notion of patterning and of form. And these you can all like classify as petaled or spiked. There's all kinds of different variations. We published a book on this with students. See, all this, of course, these are these millions of variations, but these millions of variations, so though there is a vagueness, it's a very precisely constructed notion of vagueness, right? Deleuze would say it's inexact but rigorous. It's very rigorous in its sets of operations and its methodology, but it's inexact in its outcome. Now that I connect to Worringer. Now Deleuze often quoted Worringer. There's this famous sentence about vitalized geometry. Far outstripping, this is on his book on the Gothic in 1911. This is 3 years after his famous book on abstraction and empathy, right? Abstraktion und Einfühlung. This is because basically all the German expressionists were reading Worringer in 1908, and they loved that book on abstraction. And then suddenly, 3 years later, he comes with a book on the Gothic. And they were all like shocked. All the Blau writer painters, they were all like shocked he was writing on the Gothic. But it's a very interesting argument in this book. And it's not just that he comes with this idea of the northern line, and of course Worringer is a vitalist, right? I mean, aesthetic notion of vitalism, you have to really read German aesthetics, especially after the 1860s till like the 1910s. You get tons of ideas of what at that time was called Einfühlung, right? So there's what he says. There's a notion of Einfühlung in the Gothic that is not normal in architecture, because in architecture there's always this, you encounter structure, right? And structure has to be made beautiful according to the rules of Alberti. Right? Structure has to be made beautiful by adding life to it. So you add acanthus leaves, and you add volutes, and you add garlands. But these always go at the joints, right? So the structure pre-exists, and then it's rounded off, and it's sort of sensualized by these lively additions. But here it's different. It's not structure plus life, but it's structure itself becoming life, right? Or becoming lively or vital. So it's the structure, right? That notion of the bundles, right? And the bundles coming up and unraveling into fans, and then these ribs opening and interlacing and becoming folds. There's this constant transformation of one object in the other, which is vitalized geometry, right? And this is the reason, of course, why Deleuze always quotes Worringer. What's interesting is that Worringer actually gets these quotes from Karl Lamprecht, who's writing not about the Gothic, but about illumination, which is much earlier, because the Gothic is like the 1100s till the early 1400s. But illumination is the year 600, 700. If you look at this is from the Lindisfarne Gospels, I think, or the Book of Kells, which is 700, the year 700. So there's some kind of what they call Nordicism, right? There's some which is very dangerous. There's some kind of Nordic idea of ornament, of ribs or ribbons interlacing to create form. So when he's looking at this, when Worringer and Lamprecht are looking at this, they see this as a Gothic construct, right? The ribs are undefined and they create surface. And these are examples of that. Now, what's interesting there is that this is another notion of craft that we get from savageness, right? Savageness says, okay, there is design, there's some kind of openness of design, and there's then the savageness of the laborer, of the human hands, right? That's the humanist phenomenological argument that allows it to create its own variation. But in changefulness, it is the objects themselves that have craft, right? The hands, which you see over here, the holding hands, are like the traceried ribs that hold one another. So that whole notion of collaboration is not just like in the utopian community of the Gothic medieval city, right, that the neo-Gothicists believed in, but it's also in the elements themselves, right? It's just like how the bands collaborate is already that socialism, so to speak, that Mauritian socialism of collaboration and building community is already in the elements themselves. Now this is a fantastic object. This is like more than 2 meters high, and it's now owned by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Yeah, you might find that funny, but it was actually hanging in the house of Mary Lutyens, the daughter of Edwin Lutyens. And she got it like through accident via the Millet family. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the story of Ruskin and Millet, but they were really good pals. But till they had this holiday in Scotland, right, where Ruskin took his wife and Millet over to Scotland, and it was really nice because Ruskin at nighttime he was working with Millet on a sort of what he called a new Gothic, right, and he was talking about hands and kisses, whatever, and Millet was drawing it, making sketches, and this was all meant for a large lecture like 4 or 5 months later back in London. So the idea was Ruskin would travel back with these sketches and then use them for his lecture on the Gothic, on a new Gothic. But by daytime, Millet was making some paintings with Ruskin's wife, and he was falling in love with her, which is okay, but on the other hand, this Ruskin's wife was falling in love with Millet. And that was one of the most famous scandals of Victorian celebrities that, well, it's a long story, but Ruskin sort of forgot to sleep with his wife. And it's never been properly solved. There's been lots of theories why Ruskin didn't want to sleep with his wife. He said, well, she's so ugly, she's not really meant for intercourse. He would actually say that. And but then later she would have 8 children with Millet, so that was not a very powerful argument. And so you can imagine what happens. It's like there's this totally enthusiastic Ruskin writing about fabulous Millet doing these drawings on the Gothic, reinventing tracery, and Millet at the same time falling in love with his wife. It's a fantastic story. It's just, yeah, it's not really part of the lecture. But what I find interesting is that notion of craft and spirituality and movement is already in matter itself. So to just like consider Ruskin's argument as ethical and his aesthetics as a reflection of that notion of the ethical is not correct. I think it goes much deeper. That notion of activity, right, is already deep in matter itself. So it's not just like the laborers are like that liberated and allowed to make their own northern mistakes, but it's already in matter itself that things team up and hold hands. So that's why I get to this third argument of rigidity. It's like Ruskin is normally criticized by historians of the Gothic as somebody who does not really understand structure. Right? His sections are very flat, and of course in any book on the Gothic you would get isometric diagrams of vaults and vault systems and how ribs work. But there's in the text, that's all true, but in the text there's this incredibly interesting notion of active rigidity. And of course if you've been educated by Frailto, so to speak, you understand that term very differently because you immediately understand it as form finding. So rigidity, as he says, is not like Egyptian and Greek, because though these buildings stand up, they don't do it as an activity. They do it as a passive notion of lying down, right? They sort of lie on the ground. They don't stand as an active mechanism of tension and compression. So he calls it an active rigidity. And that's interesting because though the building stands still, right? There we go, this animation argument again. Though the building stands still, there is activity, right? And this is, of course, this activity, the one on the left, right? This is like matter holding hands, tracery ribs, like teaming up, forming configurations and creating architecture. So it's like the fibers of a tree, an elastic tension. Right? And then, of course, you have to move to the opposition between Ruskin and Viollet-le-Duc, because normally the Gothic slips through in the history of modernism. Right? There's always like different notions of modernism being prepared. Even Morris, like Pevsner, he would say, look, Morris is part of this preparation of modernism. But of course, Viollet-le-Duc Kenneth Frampton calls him the inventor of the space frame, right? Because of the rhomboid geometry. But there's something else going on. There's like, because actually, though Ruskin had admired, of course, how can you not admire Viollet-le-Duc? He admired him very much. He did not agree with him at all, and especially because of that notion of cleaning out the Gothic. What basically Viollet-le-Duc is doing is it's almost like reclassicizing the Gothic as a system of determined elements. So you see compression elements, you see tension rods, you see brick, you can still steel. Like all these elements are now defined, right, as elements, as what we know it from modernism, right, as a preparation of engineering, almost like a pure transparency of elements, then teaming up, almost like a set of parts, a kit of parts, right? And of course, on the left, where you see Gloucester Cathedral, the famous south cloisters, these elements, though they're extremely articulate, they're not defined, especially not defined structurally. So beauty precedes structure, life precedes geometry, right? There's a notion of vitality that precedes instead of that where you get on the right, where it comes afterwards. So you should not mix up Viollet-le-Duc and Ruskin. So I'm sort of culminating this argument in what I call a Gothic ontology, right? So because I started like as a Deleuzian notion of the fold, but now I see it's like, okay, the fold, the Baroque fold comes afterwards. It's something that adds movement that is to something that is already there, which is of course monism, right? Monism is what you see on the top right is where you already have form, but it keeps on unfolding and unfolding, right? So which is really that notion of the fold is, I mean, a fold is basically when you have a piece of paper and you fold it. So the paper pre-exists the fold, right? The two-dimensionality of the paper pre-exists the linearity of the fold, right? So that's the fold. Basically, I'm saying, look, that notion of Deleuze's fold is something that is basically uses all the structural relationships that are already there in classicism between the piers and the friezes and the pedestals and the domes, but it just deforms them afterwards. So movement is added to the object afterwards. It's a notion of distortion. While the Gothic is actually a notion of constructivism where elements deform, but to find one another and to structure one another. So that's a notion of Gothic ontology. And it basically mixes two worlds, right? To say, I mean, in modern terms, you would say, look, it's on the one hand, it's object-oriented, because it does accept the fact that it's a separate thing. It's a discrete object, as we get it in the world of sticks and atomism, right, of Greek philosophy. But on the other hand, it does allow for deformation, as in the Baroque. Right, as in the Leibniz. So it combines two positions, one of continuity and one of discreteness, right, which I combine in that bottom image over here. So it's a world of worms, right? It's discrete worms, and by their activity they team up and create formations. So you get something that is a mixture of pluralism and aggregation and monism. So what started out as a as looking at Ruskin as a historical precedent to maybe rethink digital architecture, actually became a quite elaborate critique of Deleuzian theory of the fall. And I think when I look back, I think if I would criticize digital architecture, it's really this. It's like early 90s when we started to deform objects and then ask our engineers to harden them out for us, right? To have Arab throw in the steel for us, right? And make them stand up. I think that was the actual mistake. That was the unethical moment, or the Catholic moment, so to speak, of parametricism. Why? Because it's a universal notion of form. It's basically stucco, right? But Arab helps it to keep it up, right? It's a stuccoed world, and it doesn't. And normally you'd say, look, there's an opposition of that sculptural world of hard stucco, and there's an elementary world of, let's say, Foster or high tech or tectonics or whatever, of that notion of the joint that we find with Frampton. And I think this notion of Gothic ontology allows both for thinking the separate element, but as something that is undefined. So I think there's a lot of potential there that allows for the digital now to become understood as a craft, right, instead of like a perfect robotics. Because I think that's where we've sort of been digging a grave for ourselves, that this architecture of deformation now becomes an architecture of perfection and of robotics and of polishing, right? Which has really worked against us, if I can just say us. So I'm not sure how far I am, but in my lecture I'm almost at a third. So was this an hour?
50 minutes.
Oh, okay. So if you just want me to stop, throw something or shout or walk away, whatever. But I have a similar argument for ornament, but almost in the reverse way. So I'm basically saying, look, in the Gothic, structure becomes ornament. In this notion of ornament, I'm basically saying, look, ornament becomes configurational or structural. So I'm not that chapter, which is the second chapter of the book, The Sympathy of Things, is called The Matter of Ornament, and it doesn't look at ornament again as these acanthus leaves and garlands and putti, whatever, that are added onto structure, but it looks at these structural surfaces. And that you'll see as much in Owen Jones as in William Morris, though I sort of split them during the chapter. It's really this 19th century of ornament, of what they at that time called the diaper, which is a structured surface. Is a structured ornate surface. So, and that's interesting because in that surface all these small elements collaborate to create that larger surface. So it starts with Ruskin's idea of the wall veil, which of course if you I went from Friotto textile to Zemper textile to Ruskin. If you then see the word wall veil in one of the chapters of the Stones of Venice, you're immediately thinking of Zemper, right, of the notion of Bekleidung, right, architecture as a cloth, as a dress. And strangely enough, in Ruskin, where he discusses all the elements of the Gothic, he does not describe it as the wall, but as the wall veil. And it's a very strange chapter. It's only 6 pages, but there's 4 pages of description of the Matterhorn in there. So it starts with the description of the largest mountain in Switzerland. So Ruskin loves going to Switzerland, and then normally he would go travel. So he would normally go see the Flamboyant in Normandy, then he would travel to Switzerland to see the Alps, and then he would travel to Venice to see the Gothic, right? So there's a conceptual relationships between these. And this strange chapter of the wall veil starts with a description of the Matterhorn, which is really an expressionist description, right? It's not a mountain, but it's something that occurs in time. It's a set of activity and a set of forces. The eastern face of the promontory is hewn down, as if by a single sweep of a sword. So It's like a set of forces that create this object. And then he goes on to speak about the courses, the geological courses, because that's so great about the 19th century, like aesthetics, geology, metallurgy, everything is mixed. So he would like look at this object with as much as an architectural eye as a geological eye. And people who were reading that at the time, like William Butterfield and G.E. Street, they immediately, that's the bottom right image, which is the backside of the law, was it the law courts at the Strand, right? So the backside, it's a beautiful Gothic building, new Gothic building. The backside has these courses, and they called it at that time streaky bacon style. And that all comes from these few sentences of Ruskin, where he describes the Matterhorn as coursed, as layers of brickwork, right? And that for the English, at that time for English architects, there was a notion of polychromy, because then they could express like different bands of color, as there was a big discussion in 19th century aesthetics on polychromy. But they would then invent a structural notion of that. So it wouldn't be painted, but it would actually be an authentic form of coloring. Now that veil, I connect the veil to these very refined surfaces. So I take it quite literal, the notion of the fragile. So it's a structural notion, but it's weak elements, and these weak elements team up to create surfaces. And that's why, of course, there's a whole history in ornament that uses that filigree, inlay, guilloche, but also fretwork, that work with these tiny elements that interact and collaborate one another to make larger surfaces. Now, I connect that in the book to Zemper's idea of textile. I'm going to skip that a bit. But my theory is that Zemper got that notion of hanging. Of course, Zemper was a refugee for political reasons from Germany. He was involved in the revolution in Leipzig, or was it Dresden? And he had to flee the country, and he fled to London, where he met Owen Jones, who actually talked already about the Alhambra, the interlacement of the Alhambra in textile terms, right, as woven. So there's like this notion of textiles as the most important of the four elements of architecture actually comes from Owen Jones. But talking about hanging carpets remain the true walls. If you connect that to that perspective image that Owen Jones painted of the don't forget, Owen Jones did the interior of the Crystal Palace, right? We always look at it as an early Norman Foster, right? The Crystal Palace as something that invented high-tech and prefab, but that interior is amazingly interesting, and there's like a whole color scheme is fantastic. But he had a whole budget to buy textile, and he was hanging all these carpets in the Crystal Palace. And I'm quite convinced that Zemper actually saw this, and he got this revelation, this epiphany, right? That architecture is made by hanging carpets. So it's not the wall; it's actually the carpet that you hang on the wall, right? And it's not the wall as something that is stacked brick, but it's something that is woven out of straw or wickerwork. He would talk about the vlechtwerk of wickerwork, right, as something that precedes the notion of architecture. So he says, look, textile is really at the origins of architectural creation. It's radiating surfaces. We live between radiating polychromatic surfaces, which is actually a very Greek idea of beauty. Anyway, so he's like, he's writing Der Stil, right, that massive volume on style, but he was actually planning 3 of these volumes, and the thickest one, the numbers 2 and 3 were never written, right? And the first one, which is incredibly helpful to us, because now we don't get the whole theory. We can just get a fragment of the theory, which actually distorts his whole thinking, but it makes it very interesting for us, because for him it was textile that was the most important element of architecture. And he goes on and on about wickerwork and knotwork, as something to explain architecture. So there you go, the German word Wand, wall, right, Parias, acknowledges its origin, the terms Wand and Gewand. And Gewand means dress, right? So the notion of the wall not as a mauer, not as a solid stereotomic volume, but as something that has been woven, comes there from Semper. So basically, the theory in the second chapter goes like, okay, if we read the four elements as not as historical argument, but as material arguments, right? There you go from very soft materials to very hard materials. So we go from textile to wooden tectonics to ceramic stereotomy as a transformation from light to heavy. Why? Because in Semper's theory, the wall is not literally clothed with carpet anymore, because now the carpet has been impressed in stone. So there's what he calls a stoffwechselthese. There's a transformation of the textile into stone, right? So though for him historically the wall was covered by textile, in history that becomes ornament. Right? So the wall dresses itself in ornament. And that's a notion of patterning. So that whole idea of flexible materials of activity, finding pattern, I just see in a larger context of 20th century pattern theory, right? That we know from all these books about dunes and zebra and rivers. If you read the work of Philip Ball or Fritjof Capra, you'll see tons of these diagrams of emergent patterns, what they call emergent. And they emerge because there's movement first, and then they find structure. So I see it as a pattern theory, as in the wider context. So basically the Gothic argument of structure and ornament, and then the other argument of ornament to become a structure, they become like one pattern theory. And it basically says, nothing can be undecorated. And everything is patterned, if it's surface or structure. And they must be connected. So the main problem of architecture becomes the connection between structure and ornament. Not that between structure and program. And as a Dutch ex-architect, I'm saying that program, I don't give a damn about program. It's not about massing. It's really about connecting these two issues of structure and ornament. And we should understand them as transitory, as one movement. That these types of configurations, because they're both configurational, actually make us understand how these options collaborate and work. So tessellation ornament, of course, I have to be a bit more quick. That we know very well from Owen Jones, right? Just clearly the grammar of ornament. Well, it's not the first page. The first page is really interesting. If you skip the preface with all the proposition, the first page is the decapitated Maori head. Right? This is like a shocking image. You open the grammar of ornament, there you see this decapitated head of a warrior, which is like completely covered with ornamentation. And then he starts with his first tables on savage tribes, on savage ornament. Basically explaining that, look, what's interesting is that you get, 112 plates, and there's only 6 or 7 on Greek and Roman ornament. Can you believe it? So there's Moroccan, there's Persian, there's Hindu, there's savage. So he's saying, look, if you look at that anthropological proof and evidence about the notion of ornament, Greek and Roman ornament are only like a very small part of that history, and it's much broader. That whole notion of making surfaces is much broader than what we learned from classicism. So he's in that sense very close to Ruskin. Of course, his studies of the Alhambra also return in that chapter. But clearly, there's a difference between let's say the designers who work with ribboning and the designers who work with tessellating. Normally the designers who work with tessellating come from that notion of order. Don't forget Gombrich's book on ornament is called The Sense of Order. Right? It's how to make order sensual. And this is very important for Owen Jones as well. In the end, it's about these elements teaming up, but then finding balance and repose. Right? So there's a notion of quiet, and there's a notion of passivity, right? Not activity. But all these elements find one another, and what in the end you see is order. There's a mental origin. The great pupil of Owen Jones, Christopher Dresser, would say, look, this is an art with a mental origin. It's a very Kantian idea of seeing order. While you sense all the parts, you see order. Right? So that's very much connected to what Gombrich would later say about ornament. And clearly that doesn't have to be true. Of course, order can be very simple, as in a grid or a diagrid, but we know nowadays there are very complex notions of tessellation that don't have this notion of repose or inactivity, but actually very complex forms of tessellations, as you see in the famous Roger Penrose tessellations. These are all the same, but there's two objects only, the kite and the dart, that make this very complex object. And of course here, there's consistency here, right? There's a dry stone wall, there's consistency in the nodes, right? These are all three-legged nodes, right? If you don't look at the polygons, but you actually look at the nodes, you see how consistent the system is, but it's based on variation. So they're all Y-shaped nodes, but they all have different angles. Now, of course, with computation, we understand this much better, and these are all T-shaped nodes, right? But you also see in the breaking of glass, but there's a huge variation of types of T's. So it doesn't mean that suddenly the variation is out of the system. I think that's a mistake. You see the same with packing systems, right? There's lots of variation. It doesn't always have to be a buckyball, right? It can actually have lots of various nestings of hexagons, pentagons, and whatever gons. And then we go to ribbon ornament, where you see lines interlacing and forming surfaces, right? Guimard, Louis Sullivan, this is an 11th century Norse object, a gate to a church. Of course, ribboning you see in the hairdo. I actually do this with students, and of course the first 4 weeks they're very nervous, because now they have to look at these awful hairdos from Bavaria and Holland. And then hopefully they twist and turn them in architectural projects that don't look so corny. And you see the same in Celtic knotwork, illumination. So we do tons of these studies in how actually, if you can, you have this sort of insect brain, right, because of all this computing and scripting, and then you look at history and you see something completely different. You see sort of all these trends of patterning with very different outcomes. But actually it's very interesting to look at them from a non-historical sort of viewpoint. And then in the same second book of the Stones of Venice, you get a chapter called The Material of Ornament, where he has this famous diagram of abstract lines. So these are all lines of force, right? So Ruskin, what's interesting is that this is the contour of a leaf, this is the ballistics of a cannonball, this is a leaf, this is a glacier. So you see objects of very different scale all drawing their own types of curvature. Right? So they're expressive of action, which is quite an expressionist argument, but again, something that relates to activity and vitality. So of course in ribboning you find the same notion of precision, right? Bending, that they create like very different figures, C and S figures, interlacing, of course, things like cross, X figures, tendriling, J figures, bifurcating, Y and T figures. So when you look at it again from a scripting viewpoint, these are all very exact terms that are like scripted over history, so to speak. If you're getting bored, just let me know. Now I'm sort of looking at this. Yeah, did I hear yes? I'm looking at this as this Gothic hinge. Now, at a certain point, Gombrich is discussing Gothic hinges. And I'm saying, now, let's look at that hinge. Let's just take the hinge of Salisbury Cathedral and just look at it from a scripting viewpoint, right? There's the door, which is two-dimensional, it's flat, and there's a hinge, which is a line. We just start with a straight hinge. But of course, the forces on that hinge are far too large, right? So between the one-dimensionality of the hinge and the two-dimensionality of the door, you need to widen that line to just like ease out the forces on that hinge, right? So what does the line do? Of course, like a leaf, it needs to branch out, so you get Y figures. And then the Y figures need to spread out, so you get J figures or scrolls, right? And basically that line is now spreading out over that two-dimensionality of the door. But it's not itself becoming two-dimensional. It's a fractal, what we know as a fractal. So between the dimension 1 of the original hinge and then going via steps, via Y figures and J figures and scrolls to that two-dimensionality, it gets stuck somewhere in between. At a 1.62 dimension, right? It has a fractal dimension. And so it's a transitory object. Again, like that notion of the picturesque, it's something that has been grown, right? And that while you see its own history. You see its own generative history, right? You don't see an object then plop out like a soap bubble and then being a perfect sphere. No, you see it like what you see in a tree. Right? The trunk is older than the latest branches, and the leaves are even younger than the branches. Right? You see an object as it exists in space, but also as it is a trajectory. Right? It's basically you're connecting the notion of object and trajectory. Right? That's one thing. Or substance and transience. Right? Philosophically, that's very important because that normally the substance philosophers are the ones of being. Right? That's the Heideggerians. And the others are the ones of becoming, that is the Deleuzians or the Heracliteans, whatever. And these are always like throwing stuff at each other, right? They hate one another. There's symposia on why they hate each other so much. And basically here you see something that is merging. You see substance and transience at the same time, right? That is like both an object and a trajectory. So then I say, okay, this is a structural argument for that line spreading itself over a surface, but you can do the same with any type of pattern, and that is what Morris was doing. Right? So when Morris creates wallpaper, and it's really stunning wallpaper. I've worked like with students on this for 1.5 years on scripting Morris's wallpaper, and it's incredibly interesting and complicated. Because there's a whole logic. You can't really see them, but it says L, T, and F. This is leaf, twig, and flower, right? So in all these wallpapers, there's like different generations of leaves and twigs and flowers, how they generate one another, like in a certain, so the pimpernel or the acanthus, they all have their own sort of code, their own DNA code, right? Clearly there's no flowers here, there's not that many twigs, but there's lots of leaves. Here there are lots of leaves, not that many twigs, so there's like a whole set of relations which you can actually script. And it has to do with what he calls a notion of growth, right? Rational growth, a newborn Gothic, right? So now we have two pillars, right, of Victorian design. We have Owen Jones and William Morris. And one is trying to find repose order, and the other is trying to find growth order, right? So with one, you look at a wallpaper, Owen Jones's wallpaper, and you see a diagrid and all the figures fit, but you see it as repose. And my question then is like, okay, what do we actually see when we look at Morris's wallpaper? Now, my argument in the book is that seeing in itself is not enough to explain what is going on. You have to talk about experience or feeling, and that's especially the word experience comes in philosophical history. Clearly Kant uses it, but it's really becomes really powerful with William James and Bergson. And it's really an extension of seeing. Right? So you see the visible, but you feel the invisible. You feel something that is happening in time. It's a path in time, exactly like that growth model. You're feeling some connecting to an object, its trajectory, but you're seeing its object. Right? So I talk about seeing and feeling. see, feel. Every time we see, we can't help feeling, says Ruskin. Now, this is even a more interesting quote by Bergson, is there do not exist things made, right, which is the world of substance and being, but only things in the making, right? So, I mean, talking craft here, right? So craft is not coming after it, but craft is going on all the time. It does not leave the object when the workers are at home or dead or whatever, dead and buried. No, it's still going on. So when you look at that wallpaper, right, you experience a thing in the making. Now, and that word experience is a very complex word because it's about your body, it's about how you yourself exist in time, how you relate to that pattern, and how seeing is involved. And that we call sympathy, right? So that notion of reverberation between you and the object is then a sympathetic relationship, which is shocking. Shocking in itself. So I trace it to, of course, if I would, the strange thing is, this is this third chapter of the book, normally talking about people like Ruskin and using the word sympathy, you would go back to Adam Smith and David Hume, that already like used the term sympathy very, very much. But I felt like reading Hume and Smith that his notion of sympathy was much more dependent on his notion of time and the object and related much more to people that came after Ruskin than before him. So, which is an ahistorical argument, obviously, right? So 3/4 of my book is just guesswork, right? If not 100%. So what I'm basically doing is proving the notions of Ruskin by people, A, he did not read because they came after him, but also people like Bergson and James never read Ruskin. They actually hated him, right, because he was so Christian. Right? So I'm mixing like two ways of looking at history and trying to explain something that is actually between them instead of like trying to find a landmark trajectory through history. And that, I mean, the arguments of Bergson on sympathy, it's really about how another object can mimic another object by finding its rhythm in time instead of just looking at it. And his famous argument, and he's talking about sympathy, but it's actually about one animal killing another animal. And that makes it so interesting, right? So the Ammophila wasp is paralyzing the caterpillar to drag it back to its nest, so that the offspring of the wasp can actually feed off of it, right, for the next 2 weeks, and then it dies. But it finds the nerves, because it, of course, the poor wasp doesn't have a manual, right? So it doesn't have a manual where the nerve centers of the caterpillar are. So he has to somehow mimic it and map it on its own body to actually find these points. It's a very interesting argument. It goes a bit far to go through it now, but one of the important sentences he's using is like one is transported into the interior of an object. Now, he doesn't really say it out loud, but this is a literal description of what in Germany at that time was already called Einfühlung. You feel into another thing, another living being, another object, whatever. You can feel into something by an internal mirroring. Right? One of the most famous theoreticians of Einfühlung is actually called Theodor Liebs, and he describes it as an innere Nachahmung. So when I observe a circus performer on a high wire, I feel I'm inside him, an inner imitation. In inner imitation, there's no difference between the acrobat above me and me down below. So you look at that person on the high wire, but you feel, right, with and into that person. So there's an inner imitation, which is interesting because Boehringer later, who's sort of the last theoretician in art history, uses the word Einfühlung, actually uses it for naturalism, for external mirroring, right? For one thing looking like another. We paint a tree naturalistically because we feel empathy with it. Now what's interesting about Leaps, he actually doesn't say, look, we have to externally mirror one object with the other, but it's an internal mirroring. Now what's interesting is like, he builds his argument first as looking at objects that really move, right? So the man on the high wire, a willow tree in the wind, he feels rage when he looks at the willow tree in the wind, or when a bird flies, right? So he does that first. And what's interesting is this bird that flies, you can't see, but you can also, a part of it you can see, right? Its trajectory you can't see. Right? Of course, later with the work of Etienne Marais, you would see a pattern of that object, of that bird over time, right? By doing chronophotography, right? Which is the early invention of film. But you feel with that object in time, but you see it in space, right? So you combine that notion of seeing and feeling, which is, of course, experience, right? The notion of experience. Now, he adds to that, right, things that don't really move. And that's where it becomes aesthetics, right? So he describes the looking at a spiral at the horns of an antelope, right? Already when looking at the spiral of I follow it and its separate proportions successively, I'm making, right, again as a verb, this spiral come into existence for me or in my perception. Right, so he's not looking at a static object. He feels with that while that object is being grown in the terms of Morse, while it's being generated in terms of computing, while it's epigenetically being formed in very romantic terms, right? So there's formation in time, which you cannot actually see, but you have to experience it, right? So there's seeing and feeling that goes together. The existence of the spiral is a becoming. Right, so now the notion of real movement, of physical movement, and the notion of internal transformation become one and the same thing. Right, and that has huge influence on art history. I sympathize, this is about our work, right, columns. I sympathize with the manner the column behaves or testifies to an inner liveliness. There you go, the term liveliness again. Because I recognize therein a natural mode of behavior of my own that gives me happiness. So there's a reverberation, there's a resonance between the column, right? Between the column, a Gothic column in this case, and me, right? There's a shared happiness, right? There's a vitality that's shared between two objects. And that had a huge influence on people like Wilflin, right? The column rises in the wall, living forces are at work. Right? So when the structure is done, it's not over. It's still at work. The living forces are at work. The dome swells upwards. So he's describing it as if it is a movie. Right? As if it is a movie. And what's interesting is that normally the term Einfühlung is translated with empathy, but Leaps uses sympathy all the time. So you sympathize with that object in time. Well, I think that's it. Yeah, no, it's 20:00, so that was it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes.
Structural ornament and ubiquity strictly. What are your thoughts on Warren Nage and Deborah Hoffman? Warren Nage and Deborah Hoffman that you dealt with?
Neuroaesthetics?
Yes.
Yeah, it's just no, I think what they try to do is it's a similar notion of mirroring, internal mirroring, but by mirror neurons, basically. I'm most interested in because for me it's not about people and objects, it's also between objects and themselves. So I'm not saying that we are the source of feeling. So basically what I'm saying is everything feels, and you don't need a brain to feel it. So you don't need mirror neurons to feel it. But I've talked to Harry Mulgrave, who's very interested in this notion. He was also a neuroaesthetician. And I'm not so sure anymore. Well, I think it's the problem. You give a sort of scientific foundation of a humanist theory. So basically then you're saying again in that, because what's interesting here, if you look at Leib's, he's basically trying to cancel that whole separation of object and subject. And I think what you do then, if you place it back into the neuroaesthetics, you're saying, look, basically you put humans at the core. And I'm much more interested in that relationship between all matter, between all objects that are notions of resonance and reverberation. So for me, we don't need neurons to feel. Actually, I think a rock feels. Just very clear. Yeah.
Ruskin makes great play with the idea of the individual creative class. And I'd like to view as how the collective could conceivably work in the context of digital.
Very good question. Basically, I think I'm trying to propose a digital arts and crafts. But I'm not sure what that would look like. But I think design in that sense would be much more collective. I think the products that would come out of that type of collective would be similar to what we saw in arts and crafts, so small scale objects, not trying to find jobs in Dubai and Kazakhstan, but actually trying to make objects for where you live. So I would see that very romantically utopian. I would try to sort of wire up a utopian community. That's how I would like to dream. No, I'm just thinking of these collectives, these arts and crafts collectives, where you would have only one or two architects, and you would have lots of silversmiths and wood carvers, and I would like to, because one of the problems still is that though I'm saying, look, with digital design you can move a lot of craft to design, but it still means you have full control over the production. And I think that's problematic. I think if you look at, let's say, the work of Gaudi, where you would say, look, we only do a quarter or half of the work as architects, and then we give it away to silversmiths or blacksmiths or wood carvers, whatever. I would try to find a sort of digital way of doing that. That's what I would be really interested in, because I think that the argument of moving craft in the digital design is a valid argument, but not when it means, when you say, okay, that means we can now do everything. I found a really interesting quote from Ruskin where he says, look, where you would have all this textile interweaving of the flamboyant. And he would look at the flamboyant and he would say, look, this is not possible in Greece. Not because we're classicists, but because the marble is so hard. He says there's no logic in that first notion of craft, where you put all that labor in all these interconnections, and then need to carve it out in marble. That doesn't make sense. It does make sense, he says, in France, where the stone is so soft. So I think, like, when you say, okay, there's a lot of the notion of crafts moving towards digital design, I think we should then look again at materiality. And I think that's also one of the mistakes we made. It's like we looked at polyester, we looked at double curved glass, we looked at all these sort of impossible materials instead of what you, for instance, see in fretwork is that you just have wood and you cut it. Right? So in that case, we could take wood and laser cut it. And I'd be really interested in that. So this is like actually using the materials as they are, and maybe even in the arts and crafts, understanding of how many different materials collaborate in the building. I think digital architecture is just like, when it's that white, I think it's suspect. So I just see Baroque stucco all the time. It's just a digital version of it. And I think when you have this sort of arts and crafts notion of materialization, it would be much more dirty and hybrid.
Do you think that will work with multiple authorship as well?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Exchanging scripts and exchanging scales. Yeah, that's how I'd like to think of it. But that's not what the book is about. But it's trying to sort of throw up this idea of what I call politics of beauty. And it's very romantic in the sense that what I really like about Morris is that though at the end of his life he tries to become a Marxist, right? But he calls a scientific socialist. Right? It's called Marxism. He calls it scientific socialism. But if you read News from Nowhere, books like that, he has a very aesthetic notion of socialism. So I think it's. And when you see how often they discuss velvet or intricate belts in the News from Nowhere, as much as the relationship between men and women or between men and machines, it's all about a discussion of communality and collaboration. I think in that sense, this whole notion of politics and beauty is really interesting to Morris. I think after Morris, it's all sort of falls down into aestheticism and becomes art nouveau. And there's some remnants of what he was doing, but it doesn't have that sort of medievalist utopian notion. But that would be another book. Maybe a whole set of experiments, I don't know. I just felt like when we were doing these projects, and you were asked more in Dubai to do a project than around the corner, there's something deeply wrong with what you're doing. When you're doing more, you're designing museums instead of schools, I just became more and more nervous. So it's one of the reasons why I stopped.
I'm interested in a way, in notions of depth into what you're describing, because you use sort of terms that in some cases sound as if they are contradictory, but they sound to me more complementary, like when you refer to veils, the German notion of Wand, and pattern often is interpreted as being something quite bidimensional. But then you mentioned tectonic and sympathy and empathy issues. And there's something finally visceral about what you're describing. Mm-hmm. And it feels far more three-dimensional and far more of a sense of depth and mass than often the interpretation of something hugely ephemeral, thin, bidimensional. How much are you interested in mass? How much are you interested in the massive weight of the structure, or how much are you interested in the flatness and the lightness of the structure and the pattern?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because in the lecture, I felt that sometimes you were
very
interested in one, sometimes interested in the other.
It's what we call a depth at the surface, or a deep surface. So I'm using that term a few times, and basically I'm saying, look, there's two ways of looking at structure-ornament relationships. One is the modernist one, where the skin is so transparent you see the depth of structure, and the other is the post-modern argument, where there's a mask, right? So you get flatness and mask, or you get transparency and depth. And my argument is that the Ruskin combines both. That there is a depth of, but it's a transforming one. So the veil does refer to a depth, but it's not one that shows the truth. So it's transformative depth. It's not a visuality depth. So that's how I try to explain. But there are some discussions of mass and mass. in that chapter. Yes, yeah, so I'm trying to find a sort of depth that is non-spatial. That space. A very nervous space.